Hey everyone, it's Jalen, and I'm here today with another video. So, first of all, a lot of things are different. All my hair is gone. I moved again, which is something that happens like every 2 days for me. I moved back to university, so sadly we lost the bookshelves background, which is so sad because it was the best background I ever had, and I only got like 2 months use out of it. I wasn't sure what to use as my background because this house doesn't have many nice areas, and then I was just like, oh, what's that thing that I own that everybody turned into a meme? Tapestries, bitch. If you hated him, now you gotta look at him. For real though, if you did turn my tapestries into a meme, you have a very special place in my heart, and I love you dearly, and that's all I have to say. So in today's video, I wanted to talk about plot. A few weeks ago, I don't remember exactly when, I got an ask on Tumblr asking how to write a satisfying plot. When I wrote out that ask, I was like, oh, this is really useful, important stuff, and so I thought I would share it in a video. So whoever asked the question, thank you. So I have 9 tips for you on how to write a satisfying plot. Number 1 is genre awareness. I think this is a very important thing in so many areas. Genre awareness is exactly what it sounds like. It's being aware of the conventions of your genre, not just conventions like common tropes or whatever, but kind of what makes your genre what it is. Keep in mind that genres exist for a reason, so that people can find books that they will find enjoyable to read. So for that reason, what is a satisfying plot to read for a fantasy reader in the fantasy genre is going to be different from a romance reader reading in the romance genre versus a thriller reader reading in the thriller genre. I really stumbled over that sentence a lot. Now, of course, there are lots of books that really play with genre or twist genre or transcend genre or do funky things with genre. It's still important to have genre awareness if you're writing that type of book. If you are writing in kind of a classic genre, if you were writing a thriller, if you were writing a mystery, etc., etc., it is very important to know your genre well, because to know your genre well and know what makes a satisfying plot in that genre, you know? So for example, if you're writing romance, what's satisfying in a romance novel is going to be the romantic tension throughout, legitimate forces keeping the characters apart throughout the entire story, good chemistry between the characters, and then generally in a romance, the story ends happily. That's kind of a convention of romance. And then it's going to be a satisfying conclusion when the characters finally overcome those obstacles and finally end up together because the reader has been rooting for that because of their great chemistry throughout, and it's especially satisfying because they've been kept apart the whole book. And a lot of those same principles, obstacles, character relationships, really exist in all genres, but they appear in different ways. So that's why it's really great to have genre awareness always, but I think it's especially necessary when talking about writing a satisfying plot. Number 2 is change and growth. Stories are essentially made of change, you know? A novel is made up of a bunch of little changes that add up to create the primary change. That's really what a story is. A story is change. If there's no change, there is no story happening, there's no narrative, then it's just a situation. If you can find a moment in the plot where nothing is changing, that is not a relevant moment to be including, or the moment isn't pulling its weight within the plot. And these little changes in the plot should be causing changes within the character. If the character's emotional state and just state as a human are not changing throughout a long period of time, then that's also not really relevant to the plot. You know, the story is a story because of the character. The character is who is making this a story. So if there's no change happening in the plot and it's not reflecting as change within the character, then you've created kind of a lull in your plot where nothing is essentially happening. I would say change and growth are kind of the foundation of what plot is, but also like what story is, because that's what makes a character a worthy protagonist, is going to be change and growth across a period of time. I don't know, I'm kind of rambling now. Number 3 is setup and payoff. This is a term that is used a lot in screenwriting, but is very, I think, important for no matter what kind of story you're writing. Setup and payoff is actually quite simple as a concept. It essentially just means that what you introduce into the story pays off later on. It's like that idea of Chekhov's gun. If you have a gun lying on the table in the first act, that gun is going to be fired in the third act. Things you introduce in the beginning, even things that might seem insubstantial, turn out to be substantial and affect the plot throughout or often towards the end. If you're feeding threads into your story and then they never affect it, those threads aren't really necessary, and aren't really necessary. What's satisfying is introducing threads into the beginning and having those threads weave all the way through, and then have a causal relationship where they affect the plot in the end. Essentially, you just have an element, whatever that element is, introduced in the beginning. It might seem important at the time, or it might not, and then that element is relevant and important, hopefully in kind of an unexpected way that can be really satisfying later on. 4 is unpredictability. This is probably one of the most obvious ones. We generally expect that a good story isn't going to be predictable and a boring story is going to be predictable. In some books, unpredictability comes from actually like a drastic plot twist where everything is shaken up. But in a lot of books, you don't necessarily need a plot twist. You don't need a dramatic turn. But rather, it just means that the plot progresses in a way that could not be foreseen from the beginning, even if this doesn't happen in a kind of snap of a moment. I wish I could explain concrete ways to make your plot non-predictable. I honestly don't know how. Obviously, avoiding things like tropes and cliches is part of it, but I don't really know how to do that. This is one that I wish I could give you some good examples where I could explain how to make your plot non-predictable. I don't know what I'm saying. I want to be able to explain how to write an unpredictable plot, but I don't know how. But it is important. So I'm going to tell you what to do, but not how to do it. I'm sorry. 5 is causality. Causality, this is maybe one of the most important ones. It's honestly quite easy to thinly veil non-causally connected events as being causally connected. It's not that difficult. I've had it before in plots. I've seen it a lot of times where you have a bunch of events that are in the same book or same story. They happen to the same character and they take place in the same setting. And that, at the time, seems like it is enough to make them a story and make them causally connected, but it's not. Those are just a bunch of events that happen to the same character in the same place or in the same book. Causality essentially is a domino effect. You know, you have every scene is necessitated by the previous scene. In Poetics by Aristotle, which is one of the oldest books on storytelling theory, he explains that a strong plot is one where you cannot disrupt or remove a single event without disrupting the entirety of the whole. This really is, in my opinion, the ideal plot. Obviously, it's very hard to create perfectly in a novel. Often in a novel, you'll have a couple scenes, like flashbacks or whatever, where it's like, okay, maybe I could move this slightly, but I think it's best here. But for the most part, the majority of your plot, as many scenes as possible, should be caused by a domino effect. So every time you're adding a scene, ask yourself, if the previous scene wasn't there, could this scene still happen? And then ask yourself, does this cause the next scene? That way, instead of just having, scenes that are happening to the same character in the same place, because that's not really a story, then you have an actual story of cohesion. That's essentially how you create a really, really tight plot line. It can be really difficult, but if you're really consciously thinking of it in the planning stage, you can avoid a lot of mishaps down the line. 6 is mystery and revelation. Stories are made up of questions. A plot line or a premise in itself is kind of a question, and really it's just a bunch of little questions that make up the book, and a lot of them will need to be answered for clarity, but others need to be left on the table for suspense. We can see this most obviously in a genre like mystery, where we have a whodunit, that's a very obvious question for the plotline and one that we want answered. But at the introduction of pretty much every novel, we have a ton of questions. Who is this person? What's going on? What's going to happen? And those questions will be more specific based on the actual plot. And then this pairs with revelation. Revelation is kind of the other part that goes along with mystery. Mystery sets up, revelation ties together, and those two together are what make a plot satisfying, and this needs to happen at the proper rate. If you don't answer any questions, your plot will be really confusing. There's going to be a lot of information you're going to need to set up at the beginning, and those are questions that are being answered. So essentially, you want to answer the questions that you need to answer for clarity, and then there are going to be some questions you want to leave open. 7 is suspense and snap, and I think this goes along with the previous one. Now, suspense is obviously a common term. Snap is one I just made up because it seemed right for what I was trying to express. So I'll explain what I mean by snap in a moment. I think suspense is often tied to mystery, but I think it's a little different. I think mystery is kind of a question that you have, whereas suspense is a bit of more of a visceral stress that the reader is feeling. It's kind of like waiting for a jump scare would be the most obvious example. Character is walking down the hallway in like a horror film and you know something is about to jump out and you're tense, you're physically tense. I think mystery is more of an intellectual thing, whereas suspense is more of like a visceral reaction. It's this stress you feel related to unknown outcome rather than kind of this craving to find an answer. Similar to mystery and revelation, I think suspense goes with snap. Snap is the equivalent of revelation. It's like suspense is waiting for the jump scare. Snap is the jump scare. Snap is the culmination of suspense in this energetic moment. This is often a key moment, often an important one in the plot. It's that you've been building up so much suspense and then it snaps. I think those moments, especially in certain genres like thrillers, horror, but lots of genres really, this kind of snap moment can appear in different forms, but I think horror is the most obvious one, but you could have similar kinds of ideas in other genres. Snap is the actualization. It's actually like making use of that suspense you built up. 8 is emotional balance and cohesion. I hear writers often say, I want my reader to be taken on an emotional roller coaster, or I hear readers say the book was an emotional roller coaster. But I would be careful with this notion. Obviously, emotional range is really great and important if it's the same emotion throughout. This goes back to an earlier point of lack of change. If this emotional roller coaster you've created is lacking in other elements like logic or causality especially, then it's actually not very satisfying and it can really impact it can actually really impact your characterization. If your character doesn't have a stable emotional thread, whether they are an emotionally stable person or not, it can be really hard to track and feel their emotions. If they're just jumping from emotional state to emotional state to make the reader feel those emotions, it can actually be really hard to invest in the character and develop a sense for who the character is, because we're not actually getting a chance to experience who the character is or learn about them or what their emotional thread is because of this jumbled mess of emotions. So emotional range is good as long as it's cohesive and there's causality to it. Another aspect of this is something I made a post on once because it was a tip I learned from a professor that I thought was a great writing tip, and it's the push and pull of hope and despair. So it's essentially the idea that at any point in time in your story, there should be both hope and despair. There's always despair in the hope, and there's always hope in the despair. Without hope in the despair, then there is no point going on because there's seemingly no possible way that this problem could be resolved. It's just despair. Hope is what keeps the reader and the character going. Whereas without despair and hope, then there is no tension at all. Only hope means that there's no conflict, everything is resolved. And finally, 9 is unrest and resolution. Continuing on my theme of saying a story is essentially this, a story is essentially unrest. You could kind of essentially think of most plot lines by this model. You have a character who has some sort of emotional or internal unrest, but they don't have a way of changing it. The inciting incident happens, which gives them an opportunity to change this unrest that they feel within their life, no matter what kind of form it takes. They have this opportunity to change, and then the resolution doesn't necessarily mean they've achieved what they wanted, but it means their opportunity, their time in which they could kind of change their life has kind of come to an end. So throughout we have unrest, and then the resolution caps it off. Whether this is positive or negative, whether the character has succeeded or not, whether they've changed their life or themselves for the better or not, resolution basically means that the plot is now going to de-energize. The reader kind of knows that the story is over because this aspect of the character's life, or maybe the character's life as a whole, is not going to be changing substantially anymore. It doesn't have the opportunity to change substantially anymore in the way we were exploring throughout the novel. Sometimes this resolution isn't always fully explored. Sometimes it's kind of like the imminent promise of resolution. We know that resolution is about to happen shortly after the end, but that's basically the same thing. The imminent promise of resolution, or resolution itself, signals the end of the period of unrest, no matter what the character's emotional state is. So as kind of nihilistic as it sounds, basically it means the character can't affect or change their life anymore, really, to any significant margin. So the reader kind of feels that sense of closure. The story is over. no matter what that means emotionally. That's kind of what makes your story feel like a whole. So that's everything I wanted to say on writing a satisfying plot. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like I mentioned, this was originally a blog post. It is all the same information, and I went more in depth in the video, but if you do want to revisit these points or see them written down in note form, I will leave that post linked in the description if you want to check that out. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!